I am now recording. Hey, worship leader. Today we have with us Spencer Cormody from Leading Worship Well. How are you doing, Spencer?
Oh, hey. Before we get into things,
Yeah.
My name is Spencer Cormany.
Hey, worship leader. Today we have with us Spencer Cormody from Leading Worship Well. How's it going, Spencer?
It's going great. How are you, Jimmy?
I'm doing good.
And hold up, a train's going by right now.
So today we're going to be talking through how to pastor your church through speaking transitions. But first, I just wanted to let our viewers know who you are. If they don't know your channel, can you give us a little brief snippet of who you are, what you do at Leading Worship Well?
Yeah, I started Leading Worship Well. This is my third year now, and essentially started off with just worship leading tips. I was posting worship leading tips every single day, so that's still what I'm doing. I do that over on Instagram and Facebook at Leading Worship Well. I've kind of expanded to YouTube over the years, and so this is like, I started in April of last year, so I've been on YouTube for a year, and I'm still posting worship leading tips. So I post stuff every single day to help worship leaders lead worship well.
Yeah, I actually found you on Instagram. That's where I first started following you, and I loved the what was it? The Wednesday new chord worship
New chord Wednesdays, yeah.
Yes, I was like, oh, this is cool. I like this, and it's consistent. And your YouTube channel,
I got rid of them.
And then you got rid of them. I know you ran out of. You played all the chords.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, awesome. Well, let's dive in. I'm glad that you're here. I'm thankful you're here. I've learned a lot from you already, and so I'm glad that my peeps on the Hey Worship Leader channel can get some wisdom. Go follow his channel. Today, like I said, we're talking about pastoring your church through speaking transitions, and so yeah, Spencer, what's your thoughts on that? How do we do this?
Yeah. So I've kind of got three. I always work in like list of things. That's how my mind works. So I've got like three things that I have in mind of how to pastor your church through speaking transitions. And obviously speaking transitions are super important. So first of all, we have to understand that we need speaking transitions in our worship service, and we aren't just song leaders, like we are worship leaders. And part of that means that we are leaders. Like the first part is worship, and we kind of cut out the musical part of that. We just call ourselves worship leaders, but we are musical worship leaders. So the first part of that is music, but then the second part is we are leaders. So we are leaders in the church, whether you want to be or not. Like you aren't just a musician. Your responsibility is to lead your church. And what that means when it comes to speaking transitions is you are teaching your church something. You are a theologian, essentially. Like you are teaching them who God is. You're teaching them about worship. And so in order to do that and to pastor your church through speaking transitions, you need to have a theology of worship. And you need to build that up. So you don't have to like go to seminary to have a theology about worship. There's so much studying that you can do on your own, and you can build a really solid foundation of theology. So starting off, I just want to ask worship leaders who are watching this video, like, what's your theology of worship? Could you describe or answer some of the main questions that people might ask about worship? Like, why do we worship God? What's the purpose of us worshiping together as a church on Sunday? And so to build your theology, just think about those sorts of questions and start to dig and find the answers and read books and listen to podcasts and attend conferences and watch Jimmy's videos where he talks about theology of worship. And that'll help you grow your theology. And then a lot of people ask, well, what do I say whenever I speak between songs? And I think it starts with that theology piece.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, because this is one of the topics that I didn't get early on. When I started leading worship, I didn't have anybody telling me this. And so I got on stage and started leading songs and had no concept of how to lead people to think like a theologian, to lead them well. And so my mind wasn't even there asking these questions. That's good stuff.
Yeah, and you think about when somebody doesn't have that understanding and they see these other worship leaders who have speaking transitions, who are like pastoring their church through speaking transitions, and then what's our default if we don't understand that we are worship pastors pastoring our people? We just like throw out the sing this line out next
Yeah.
or I don't know,
Yeah.
you may be seated, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
we could have more content than that.
My mind goes to now that we know that this is something we have to do, how do we go about doing this? How do we shepherd our people? That's how I say it at Hey Worship Leader. It's one of my core values too, is like, man, we should shepherd our people. How do we go about doing this?
Yeah, well, just going along with that language, like the idea of shepherding people, pastoring and shepherding, kind of the same thing. So just to reiterate on that first point first, like whenever you shepherd people, you are leading them somewhere. So tip number one was all about knowing where you're leading them. So on to the second thing is, if you want to lead people well, you have to prepare in advance. And so whenever it comes to your speaking transitions, I think a lot of people think it's just more spiritual, or it's the right thing to do if you just say something in the moment, and then it's like, well, that was from the Spirit. So it was better that way than if I had prepared in advance. But I want to remind people that the Holy Spirit is working all throughout the week. He's not just with you whenever you're leading worship, whenever you get on stage. He's with you in your preparation. So we can be Spirit-led and prepare our speaking transitions in advance. And it's not like this scripted thing. It's this: the Spirit spoke to me this week, and now I'm communicating that to my church. And I think about it this way, like I said before, we're theologians. We're leading people, we're teaching them in the church, and that's kind of true of your pastor too. Like your pastor is a worship leader as well. They're just leading people in a different form of worship whenever they're preaching, but you'd expect your pastor to prepare for their message, right? You don't just want them to show up on Sunday and talk for a half an hour and they never prepared anything. So we're in the same position. So we need to prepare in advance as well. And that's okay. Like, I want to give people permission to prepare in advance.
Yeah, because often, that's a good word. Oftentimes, I feel like I'm not going to prepare because I want the Spirit to lead in the moment is just a cop out for I'm too lazy to do it. That can happen. I know that's been true of me.
Hey, I didn't say it. You said it.
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, just knowing that the Spirit is not bound by time. You know, he can lead in the moment, and we hope he does. We prayed that, but we don't keep from preparing during the week because he is there during the week too. That's great. So, man, so moving on to, that's how we go about setting our mind to shepherding well, to pastoring our people. So what are some action steps that we can take?
Yeah, so we've talked about why you need to pastor your church. We talked about the importance of preparing in advance. And I feel like a lot of people just stop there, but I want to give you some practical tips of how you can actually craft a speaking transition, because that's what people want to know, right? Like they want to know, how do I actually, like, what do I actually say? And so first of all, I'll just say, like, I'm going to condense this a lot, but a while ago I think it was like a 5-part series on the Leading Worship Well YouTube channel. Is like, I was looking at the amount of content that it was, and it was literally like over 2 hours of how to speak while leading worship. I'm not even sure how I did it, but I think it was very in-depth. So if you're like really serious about what do I say at the beginning of my worship service, what do I say between songs, how do I pray during worship, any time that you have to speak during your worship service, go over to the Leading Worship Well YouTube channel and you'll find it. It's like what to say while leading worship, the ultimate guide or something. But for those of you who just want the quick and dirty formula, I'll call it a formula. People push back on that, but I think it's just the way of like setting a structure in my mind.
That's what we want. We want the formula. Yes. Give it
Good.
to us.
I'm glad you want the formula. Some people don't like the
Some
formula.
people don't want the formula.
No. So I've kind of structured it in 4 questions that you can ask to help you know what you need to say whenever you're leading worship. So the first 2 questions are just for you as the worship leader to gather your thoughts. So the first question is, where are we going in the service? So once again, you are a leader. So if you're leading people somewhere, you've got to know where you're leading them. So you want to answer that question first. Where are we leading people in the service? And you can think about that in 2 ways. You can think about it in like a smaller form of, okay, this is my worship set, and whenever you pick out a worship set, I hope you have like a theme or something, or you have a reason for picking the songs that you're picking. And if you never explain that to people, then they usually aren't going to pick up on it. So first, identify where you're headed in the service. So that's the first way you can think about that question. The second way is in terms of where is the whole service headed. Like, you've coordinated with your pastor and you've got a vision for this is where we're leading the church on Sunday. So just identify those things first, and then we'll talk about how to incorporate them into your speaking transition after that. So that's question number one. Jimmy, where have you led your church in a worship service in the past? Just trying to give some examples.
Yeah, I think most recently something that's on my mind is like leading the church to behold God. We sing a song at our church called Behold the Lamb by Passion. And just this, it's one of my favorite things to do because it's what I'm doing, preparing my heart for worship. Is like I've been perhaps looking in a different direction all week long, and I need this time with the body as we're gathered to shift our eyes from what I've been looking at all week and behold God for who he is. And so setting up a song like that, we're going to sing a song. And so I feel like it's important because that's what's going through my mind. And like you said, they're not just going to pick up on it. I mean, often when people are coming from church, they're thinking about a lot of different things. They're thinking about the person next to them that maybe they don't like. You know, they're thinking about whatever that could be going on in that moment. And I think it's up to us to direct their thoughts, and that's our responsibility.
Yeah. So beholding God could be somewhere that you're headed in your worship set, or maybe it's just like you have a sermon series and we've been talking about whatever your key point is, that God loves us no matter what. Like, that's a super general example, but you want to identify those things first because that's going to set us up to understand what we need to actually say to our church. So that's the first question. Where are we going in the service? The second question is, how are we getting there? So you've got a roadmap for your service in the form of a set list and the other elements in your service, a time of giving, the preaching, whatever it is. Just identify those key points of how you're getting to where you're going, because that's going to form what you say too. We're going to be talking about in a second about telling your church what they need to do and not just teaching them. We'll get to that in a moment. But it's also going to show you where your speaking transitions come into play. So if you've ever wondered, where do I need to have a speaking transition? Well, first you have to identify the elements of your service and identify those transition points. So what are some transition points, Jimmy? Some obvious ones.
Yeah, for us, it's we have a simple service. We only do 3 songs, but the way they're laid out are very intentional. Just for example, going into communion. We do communion at our church about once a month. And just thinking through, usually it's right after the sermon. So we have a transition there where we're going from the sermon. We start music. They pass out the elements. We take it. But so I'm specifically talking about right after communion into worship, because this can be a reverent time because we're dealing with our sin. But then it needs to be celebratory because we're celebrating Jesus' blood on the cross as sacrifice for us. And so I love taking people on that journey to remind them that, hey, now we're celebrating. Let's celebrate together and end the service with this big celebration moment. And they need leading there. You know, I have to prepare in advance. I write down what I'm going to say so I know how to transition them out of that moment into the next moment and not make it seem separate. Like, okay, we just took the Lord's Supper. That's over. Now let's sing this song that I prepared that has nothing to do with it. But I try to really make sure that we're bringing them on that journey and that it's all cohesive together.
Yeah, and that brings me to the next question. So we talked about the first 2 questions were for us as worship leaders to sort of form our thoughts. Like, where are we going in the service? How are we getting there? And then the third one, which the third question now is where we start to craft our speaking transitions, which is what I just heard you talk about, Jimmy. And the question is, what does my church need to know? So we've identified everything on our part that we have, like these sort of presumptions. I think we presume that people know all of the things that we just talked about in the first 2 questions, but they don't really know where we're headed in the service or how we're getting there. So now we need to ask the question, what does my church need to know? And so you start thinking about, like Jimmy was talking about, communion. Okay, we reflected on our sin, but then it's a celebration because of the work of Jesus on the cross, and we're remembering what he did, that his body was broken for us and that his blood was shed for us. Like, that's something that your church needs to know and be reminded of so that they can be led well in that moment. So that's a perfect example of letting your church know like what they need to know. I think another thing could just be, another example would be like a line in a song that you want to explain.
Yeah.
So if you're doing a new song, you say, hey, this is something interesting that I found whenever I introduced the song Reckless Love to my church one time. Not a lot of people knew what leaving the 99 meant. And I was really surprised by that. But that's an example of teaching on that. And you can even read the scripture where the shepherd left the 99 sheep to seek out the one who was lost. And then that's going to inform their understanding whenever they sing Reckless Love and talk about leaving the 99. So things like that, like what do you know that your church might not be thinking about that they need to know in order to better participate in corporate worship?
And I think what's a good point to add is that we as worship leaders can assume they know, and they don't always know even something simple, because we have a lot of people in the church who may not know scripture as well as we do. And so not to assume that they know, but also a lot of people in our church do know these facts, but it's hearing it again. A lot of times I'll hear you say something on your channel or another channel or a mentor of mine, and it's not that they've said anything that I haven't heard before, but just hearing it again, it's like it blesses and encourages me again in that moment. And so even if you feel like, oh, they already know this, I don't need to say this, I would encourage you to say it. Let them know where to go, because even if they do know it, it can encourage them in that moment.
Yeah, I think of don't be afraid to repeat yourself, like over and over again.
Yeah.
Especially because we're so forgetful, like it's easy to forget things. So don't be afraid to repeat yourself whenever you're talking about what does my church need to know. So first three questions: where are we going in the service? How are we getting there? What does my church need to know? The final question is, what does my church need to do? So good leaders in the church don't just teach people something, they give them an action step. So it doesn't just stay knowledge, but it's, okay, this is the basis for what we're about to do, and now let's do it. And so whenever your pastor does that, whenever they're preaching, it's like, okay, well, Jesus said that we're supposed to share the gospel with people. He doesn't just say we're supposed to do that. He says, now let's do it, right? So whenever you're leading worship, you lay out that understanding of what does my church need to know, and then you lead them in, okay, now this is what we're going to do about it. So some examples of that could be like as simple as, now that we know what we're singing about, let's sing this out. Or it could be, this song is about the faithfulness of God, so let's take a moment to reflect on God's faithfulness in our lives, and you just have a moment to reflect on that as a church together. Or I want you to pray this line over somebody because we are to be edifying and encouraging each other during corporate worship. Anything like that. You want to give them an action step of something that they're actually supposed to do, so it's not just knowledge, but then you lead them into doing something.
Man, this was super helpful. I know, like you said, we could go really deep into all these, but I think these are really good bullet points to get people thinking about how can, as soon as all this craziness of the quarantine is over, when they get back on stage, they're leading their churches. I think these are really good steps to keep in mind as we have this duty to lead the church, to pastor them. So, man, I really appreciate it. Oh, go ahead.
If I could for a moment, just thinking about the current situation that we're in, I was thinking about how much more important speaking between songs is right now.
Yeah.
Because we can't see our church, and I've seen it a couple times where the worship leaders have just become music leaders, and it's like the beginning of your service is just music, and it's worship music, but it's not being led. So if you can incorporate these speaking transitions and actually lead people in their homes, you can still use the same exact questions that I just gave you to lead people whenever they're watching your live stream or whatever. Like, it's even more important now whenever people are so tempted to just have the video on in the background and sort of check out.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I've actually been doing a video pre-Sunday to prepare the church, our people for worship. I'm giving them the songs in advance and saying, here's what we're going to be singing. This is the songs we're going to be listening to through a screen together as a church. And I would lead them well even before Sunday, so that it kind of prepares our hearts for that. So yeah, that's how we're doing it in this context. Man, Spencer, I appreciate you being here on the channel. I have learned a lot from you. And man, if you, hey, worship leader audience, do not follow Leading Worship Well, go to the channel, like his videos. They're very helpful. Subscribe to his channel. And is there anything else you want to say?
I don't think so. I think you covered it. Thanks for having me, Jimmy.
Yeah, awesome. All right, guys. It was good. I will see you later. Thanks, man. Bye.